You're live.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the September 4th meeting of the Joint Audit and Evaluation Committee. I'm pleased to be here with our House Chair, Delegate Solomon. And I know we have a busy agenda today. We actually have brought in our colleagues from the Joint Cybersecurity Committee as well. And so we welcome our Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Biotechnology to be with us this afternoon. There's a lot going on with this audit, and we also have some presentations. So I think I'm going to stop there and just see if our House Chair has anything else to add before we just jump right into it.
Uh,
Chair Solomon?
yeah, thank you, Chair Lamb. Just want to welcome our colleagues from the Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, and wanted also to just announce we're going to hear from them later. But we're really lucky. Our longtime director of auditors, Greg Hook, had retired earlier this summer, and so we want to welcome Brian Tannen as the new Chief Legislative Auditor, and then Christine Timanis as his Deputy Legislative Auditor. So we're really excited. Both of them have long storied careers with the Office of Legislative Audits. I'm really excited that they're taking over the reins, and you're going to hear from them later. And then with that, I think we are going to turn it over to Ricky Duncan and Michael Rubenstein from the Department of Legislative Services to give us a history of the Department of Information Technology as we dive into this.
Okay, give me 1 second to set up and make sure everything's good. Okay. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? No? Okay.
I don't see it, Ricky. If you need me to put it on, I can.
Should have worked. We'll try one more time.
Here we go.
Now it's there, right?
You got it.
Excellent. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, chairs of both the Joint Audit and Eval Committee and my former committee, the Joint Cyber, IT, and Biotechnology Committee. It's great to see you all again. So this is a brief history of the Department of IT and the Major IT Development Project Fund. The purpose of this presentation is to provide some sort of expository information and a historical context for the ongoing conversations that you all are going to have into the future by talking about the statutory history of these organizations or the fund and do it. This is just a lot of acronyms that I will be using throughout the presentation. As we all know, in the world of IT, acronyms are just very common. I just want to have them all in one place in case you need to reference back to them. So the topics that we're going to cover in this presentation is kind of chronologically 2002 with the establishment of the Major IT Development Project Fund, which from here on out, I'm just going to refer to as the Project Fund, hopefully, if I remember to do so. 2008 with the establishment of Do It, sort of 2009 to 2023 timeline for both the Project Fund and Do It. 2024 and present day, because as we all know, there was some significant legislation that passed this past session to affect both the fund and Do It. And then we're going to end the presentation with some kind of background data and information for you guys to provide a little more context. So in 2002, chapters 467 and 468 established the Project Fund. And in doing so, there were 3 major changes enacted. First, it replaced the previous Information Technology Investment Fund with the new Project Fund in order to fund major projects. The legislation also defined what constitutes a major project, which would therefore be eligible for funding with the new fund, and established responsibilities for the Chief of IT, which was a position within the Department of Budget and Management before Do It was established. So why the legislation was needed, we went back and looked at kind of the bill file and the old information from 2002. At the time, several major IT procurements had recently failed, resulting in the loss of millions of dollars. And as a consequence, this legislation was proposed to grant additional authority and power to the chief of IT in reviewing and approving projects to try and make sure that failures and losses like that wouldn't happen into the future. So a little more detail on the establishment of the fund. The old ITIF was repealed, and the fund balance was transferred over to the new project fund. The new project fund was established as a special non-lapsing fund to generally support general funded projects, establish some funding sources, but allowed $1 million per year to be used for other purposes such as pilot programs, education, prototypes, things like that. The legislation also established a process for state agencies to apply for funding from the new project fund. So in order to qualify for funding from the project fund, a project had to meet one of these three criteria, either having a total estimated development cost of at least $1 million, supporting one of these critical business functions, or if the Secretary of Budget and Management at the time determined that the project required the special attention and consideration given to the development projects. As we'll see as we talk about the future, this remained pretty much unchanged until this past year when it was expanded upon. And as I mentioned before, the Chief of IT was a position within the Department of Budget Management prior to the establishment of DO-IT. And their responsibilities under the new legislation was to administer the new fund, review and approve funding, but only under specified circumstances to make sure that new projects were consistent with statewide plans, policies, and any other rules in place, and to annually report to the Governor, General Assembly, and publicly on the new project fund's finances and some other specified issues related to the funding of projects. So, fast forward 6 years, nothing really happened legislatively, statutorily with the fund. We come to Chapter 9 of 2008, which created DO-IT as a state agency. Excuse me. And transferred the responsibilities of the old Chief of IT and Office of IT within DBM to DO-IT, including the management of the project fund. DO-IT was also designated as a primary procurement unit and control agency for information technology, and the obsolete provisions related to the Chief of IT were repealed, and that included the previous IT board, which was kind of a board meant to help DBM in managing and overseeing the state's information technology. So why was the legislation needed? And this comes from the governor's office circa 2008, as it was an administration bill that created the Department of IT. They argued that computers and IT had become paramount to the operations of nearly every state agency, which kind of surprises me that it wasn't every state agency at the time. And they argued that the legislation was the first step towards a centralized statewide IT infrastructure under a state agency that would report directly to the governor, and that would result in streamlining efficiencies and cost savings. And they also argued that a state agency, kind of the structure they were envisioning, would be able to respond more quickly to advances in technology, which, as we all know, happened at light speed sometimes. So this is just kind of the existing responsibilities that were DBMs that got transferred to DO-IT. Just very quickly, administration of the project fund, development of the statewide sort of IT plans and policies, management and development of the state like IT systems, like the I think it's called One Maryland, the fiber optic network, and the telephone relay system, and ensuring non-visual access standards so everyone can access state systems. The new responsibilities, sort of the major one was the procurement that I mentioned before. DO-IT was designated as the primary procurement unit and control agency for IT. And what that meant was that DO-IT could both conduct its own procurements for IT and control the IT procurements for other state agencies. And this is just, in statute, there's a list of sort of the duties of the Secretary of Information Technology. And at the time, these were the initial 5 that they have since expanded to 13, I think, or 12 total responsibilities. I will not read them all right now, but they're all here. So next stop, we're going to cover the major and significant changes to the project fund that happened from 2009 to 2023. There were 4 years where major legislation was passed to adjust how the fund worked. So 2011, Chapter 65 added additional rules related to life cycle plans for funding eligibility through the project fund, and specified that certain funds would no longer accrue to the project fund and would instead accrue to the general fund. In 2014, it was Chapter 137 required RSA revenues to accrue to the project fund. RSA stands for Resource Sharing Agreements. And just really quick, it's usually when a private company or someone else is using state technology like a radio tower, they'll pay the state some amount of money as part of the contract, and those are called resource sharing agreements. But the legislation specified that it does not apply to certain agencies, including MDOT, the Maryland Department of Transportation, until 2019, when the BRFA, Chapter 16 of 2019, required RSA revenues from MDOT to accrue to the project fund, but specified that the revenues from the Baltimore City Community College would no longer accrue to the project fund until 2021, when the revenue from MDOT would no longer accrue to the project fund and MDOT would be able to keep its revenue. So sort of the condensed version of this is that there's been a lot of discussion and debate over what money should go into the project fund over this time period. So similarly, there were kind of 4 major years with major legislation for the Department of IT from 2009 through 2023. In 2017, Chapter 590 transferred the oversight responsibilities for IT procurement to the new Office of State Procurement within the Department of General Services. DOIT was no longer the control agency for IT procurement. But I want to note that it wasn't only DOIT that sort of lost this ability under that legislation. My colleague Michael's here in case there are any questions after the presentation about this legislation in particular and the procurement. But Chapter 590 sort of centralized a lot of state agencies' procurement authority within the Department of General Services. In 2018, Chapter 467 required the IT master plan to include information related to security, required annual security training for employees handling security sensitive information. And Chapters 631 and 632 required DOIT to adopt new non-visual access procurement standards and develop a clause to be included in IT contracts related to non-visual access. Give me 1 second. In 2021, Chapter 318 created 3 new cybersecurity related responsibilities for DOIT, which we'll get into in a little more detail in the next slide. And then Chapters 241, 242, and 243 significantly expanded DOIT's various state agency and local government responsibilities related to cyber and IT modernization. And we'll cover that in a little more detail in a second as well. So additional responsibilities for the Secretary of IT under Chapter 318 were consulting with the AG related to cybersecurity for state agencies and higher ed. Similarly, consulting with the legislative and judicial branches of state government related to cybersecurity, and developing guidance for cybersecurity strategies for local government entities. Kind of the theme of the legislation was we all need to be communicating and on the same page when we're covering cybersecurity and cybersecurity related issues. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the other major requirements from Chapters 241, 242, and 243. I have another presentation that's an hour long that just covers everything this legislation did. But we're going to do the quick, short summary version. So first, it codified and expanded on the executive order that created the Office of Security Management and the State Chief Information Security Officer position, both of which were in DOIT. The original executive order was called the Cyber Defense Initiative. Required DOIT to ensure units of state government receive cybersecurity assessment at least once every 2 years. It gave DOIT some authority to sort of respond if in case an agency was not rectifying their cybersecurity assessments. However, there's a very important specific that DO-IT cannot get involved if they're preempted by federal law from doing so. And then, as you're all aware, it required the Office of Legislative Audits to redact certain cybersecurity findings from their audit reports. Planning-wise, it required DO-IT to develop a cybersecurity centralization strategy and OSM capacity study to ensure that they were fully staffed enough to sort of handle the new responsibilities. Required the IT master plan to include cybersecurity issues, and required the utilizations of National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is a federal organization, best practices related to cybersecurity. Responsibilities-wise for DO-IT, the legislation required the IT master plan to centralize the management of IT policy under the executive branch under DO-IT. But it specified that the plan developed by DO-IT must allow state agencies to maintain their own IT units and staff. As a note there. Related to oversight, the legislation required DO-IT to annually evaluate new technologies to see how well they would be useful for public sector services, things like that. Implement a governance, risk, and compliance model across state government. And limitations-wise, there was a requirement in the legislation that said DO-IT is not responsible for the normal day-to-day operations normally conducted by state agencies and local government entities, as they do their day-to-day work. Okay, so present day and the legislation from just 6 months ago, there are two major pieces of legislation. Chapter 496 of 2024, all of which relates to the artificial intelligence generally. It expanded DO-IT and the Secretary's responsibilities related to procurement and use of AI, required inventories of state agencies to see who, if anyone, is using AI at this time, authorized a new procurement process for proof of concept procurements under certain circumstances, and required the development of an AI roadmap with plans to review the risks and opportunities associated with AI. And Chapter 497, which we'll cover in a little more detail after this, expanded DO-IT's responsibilities related to the modernization and centralization of information technology. Because history is cyclical, we renamed the project fund back to the Information Technology Investment Fund. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to it as ITIF. And modified the funding process and created a new category of project called expedited projects. And the reason we're here required the Joint Audit Committee to consult with the Cyber Committee to study and make recommendations related to DO-IT's audit issues. So a little bit additional detail on Chapter 497. For project requests, state agencies have to provide additional information related to the IT projects and funding requests they're making for ITIF. DO-IT is allowed to request that funds be withheld for a project if an agency fails to consistently report the project status information to DO-IT, or if there are other implementation issues that exist. The expedited projects that I mentioned before were defined as a project that would move forward in a more nimble and expedited manner. And the legislation requires 20% of the money each year to be set aside for any such project. And eligibility-wise, the $1 million threshold for a project to be eligible was increased to $5 million. So under this change, a project must be cost at least $5 million instead of $1 million to be eligible for funding, unless it meets those other one of those other two criteria that I mentioned before. So the final slide we have is just some background information covering fiscal 9, which was the first year DO-IT existed, all the way up to fiscal 25, noting that, data from fiscal 24 is the working appropriation and fiscal 25 is the budget allowance right now. The top left chart shows the total number of projects each year that receive funding through the project fund, the annual appropriation of the project fund, then the DO-IT's total number of positions, as well as the little bar shows how many of those positions are vacant each year. And then the final slide shows DeWitt operating budget, with the orange portion showing how much of that operating budget is the chart above the annual appropriation for the project fund. I think the main takeaway from these slides is that the responsibilities for DeWitt have grown substantially since their inception. Yeah. So with that, I just want to thank, we put this together relatively quickly, so I want to quickly thank Michael Rubenstein, Patrick Frank, Yashadar Arai, and Steve Ross for helping get all this information together. And if anyone has any questions, I think we're good to go.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Chair Solomon.
Thank you, Chair Lamb. I'm sorry, out of practice here, putting my hand up. Ricky, just a quick question. Was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about what the sort of formal legislative language is for DeWitt's oversight responsibilities as an agency.
I think that is a very complicated question, and I think that's kind of at the heart, from looking at the audit previously, of what's the big question and like why we're all here at this meeting. I tried to, in the presentation, make note of everywhere that I saw the word oversight or the legislation referenced oversight. But like I said before, we did this relatively quickly, so that's something that either maybe OLA or DeWitt could speak better to, or that's something that I could maybe look into and get back to you.
I think that would be really helpful to get sort of the DLS OLA official opinion on what current statute describes DeWitt's oversight role as, because I think you're right, that is sort of the heart of this audit and what we're going to be talking about, thanks to Chapter 497. Thank you. Any other questions? And I'll note we've been joined by Chair Kaiser.
Great. Any other questions from the committees? All right, seeing no further questions. Mr. Rubenstein, was there anything you wanted to add, or are you here just for assistance and questions?
No, I was just here to answer questions, especially around the procurement issue, because I know that's also come up in the past.
Okay, great. Seeing no questions, we can move forward on the agenda. Next on the agenda, by no coincidence, is requirements of Chapter 497, which Mr. Duncan just went over briefly with all of us. I think Chair Solomon asked a very operative question, which all of us have been looking at when we look through the report. And there seems to be some discrepancy between the understanding of the responsibilities that DeWitt has and what many of us had the impression that DeWitt had the ability to be able to do. And so I think that's at the crux of a lot of what we're looking at here. Obviously, there'll be more discussion. So, Chair Solomon, anything else you want to say as an intro or tee up to this? If not, we can hand over to the other cyber co-chairs.
No, I think you hit on it, and just appreciate the passages of legislation from our colleagues on HGO in the House and EEE in the Senate. I'll pass it over to Chair Freihester.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to provide just a touch of context on Senate Bill 982, and just thank all of my colleagues and co-chair Kaiser for joining the joint audit today. We've been looking at this issue of IT modernization and the amount of money that the state spends and what it gets for that money for several years. And I think, where I'm at is that this really is analogous to Maryland's transportation system. Everybody uses it. It's absolutely necessary for daily life. And we only notice when it's not working. And that's why it's so important that we get this right. And so after having studied the importance of updating legacy systems for years, one of the themes that emerged was the need to create kind of the Modernized Maryland Oversight Commission, which Ricky mentioned. And so that commission came into being, and then there was a report that recommended some changes to the major IT fund. And so fast forward to 2024, and we introduced Senate Bill 982, which really was, introduced to try to look at how we can better update our legacy systems. At the same time, there were a couple other bills introduced that had the same topic. Senate Bill 247, which made some small changes to the Modernized Maryland Oversight Commission, and Senate Bill 294, which made some changes to the MITD process. And so we had a mini work group actually during session to try to combine all three of these bills, and the output of that was Senate Bill 982 as amended. Just as our amendments were kind of crossing the finish line, we received the audit report, and really we're concerned about some of the red flags in the report that we'll be talking about today. And so this led to the drafting of the amendment, which you see in section 4. And really our thinking was, rather than trying to make substantial changes in the oversight of the major IT fund during session, we would take some time, pull in joint audit, and do a deeper dive to really make sure that our recommendations were spot on. And so section 4 says, that in the Joint Audit and Evaluation Committee, along with the Joint Committee on Cyber, IT, and Biotech, shall study and make recommendations for any statutory and operational changes necessary to address the findings of the audit issued in April. And so that's really why we're here today. And so I hope this is the start of a constructive dialogue, and really look forward to hearing both from the auditors and from the Department of IT and Secretary Savage, as well as the questions from all of you here on this call. So with that, I will pass it over to my co-chair, Delegate Kaiser.
I have nothing to add. Senator, thank you as always.
Great. I think with that, we can move on to the audit component of the hearing, and we will bring forward
Senator Lamb, I just wanted to make
Yeah.
one comment before we move on. I think as we heard from Senator Freihester, it's a very complicated topic, and we're going to hear a fairly complex audit going forward. So I think this is going to probably require a much deeper dive on the part of our two committees to get to a set of recommendations that we hope can be operational going into the 2025 session. So I think the one thing we wanted to flag for members of our committee, I think we're going to put a work group together. So as we go through this, and certainly if this is something that you're particularly interested in, please let Senator Lamb and I know whether you'd be interested in serving on the work group as we put the nuts and bolts of this together going forward over the next couple of months.
Great. Good point. Good reminder. Seeing no other comments or questions, let's bring up Mr. Brian Tannen, our new legislative auditor. Welcome. It's good to have you here as the legislative auditor for our committee, and you have a team that you'll bring up as well. Go ahead. Brian, I think you're muted.
Okay, off to a great start. Good afternoon, co-chairs, members of the Joint Audit Committee and Evaluation Committee, and members of the Joint Committee on Cybersecurity, Information Technology, and Biotechnology. For the record, I'm Brian Tannen, your newly appointed legislative auditor, and my team is here today to present the key findings in our March 2024 audit report of the Department of Information Technology. The audit report contains 16 report findings, most of which fall into 3 areas that we're going to be addressing today. First, do its oversight of major information technology development projects, or MITDPs, including 2 projects that are significantly behind schedule, not fully functional, and over budget. Second, do its procurement and monitoring of contracts for Network Maryland, the state's private high-speed network. And third, deficiencies with the information systems and controls, which will be addressed in a separate confidential section. Due to the significance of the report findings and the number of repeat findings, some of which go back more than a decade, the report was rated unsatisfactory in accordance with OLA's longstanding and JAEC-approved rating policy. As a result, OLA will be conducting a formal follow-up of the findings in the months to come. It's important to note 2 things about the findings in the report that we're going to be presenting today. First, they address activities that occurred prior to the current administration. And second, they address DO-IT's role as a control agency and service provider to other state agencies. That second point is important because virtually all of the department's disagreements to our MITDP findings relate to its role and responsibility as a control agency and its definition of oversight. OLA believes that DO-IT has the responsibility and the authority to ensure MITDPs are well developed, properly procured, and effectively monitored to ensure the state receives the services being paid for in accordance with the related contracts. I will leave it to my team to discuss the details of these findings and related disagreement, but there is no disputing that DO-IT's approach during the audit period did not work and contributed at least in part to the failures identified in the report. At the risk of sounding like my predecessor, Greg Hook, when looking back at some of the failed IT projects identified that the states had in the past and some of the issues that we identified in the report, I can't help but think of Winston Churchill's famous quote in his 1948 speech to the British House of Commons: "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Unless there is significant change to how DO-IT manages the state's MITDP contracts, we will continue to see failed IT projects and wasted state funds. Of note, I was involved in a 2013 audit report on eMaryland Marketplace, a predecessor to the current system that is being addressed in this report. That report contained many of the same findings that we are now addressing today, almost a decade later. That said, I'm both optimistic and appreciative for the current administration's written testimony and status report, which acknowledge the need for change and indicated progress in implementing several of our recommended actions in this report. I will now turn it over to Matt Street, Rob Wells, Rob Smith, and Lauren Franchak to discuss the key findings in this report.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Robert Smith. I was one of the senior auditors for the audit. Today, I will be summarizing certain key findings regarding MITDPs before turning it over to one of our audit managers, Rob Wells, who will be discussing specific findings related to 2 projects, and senior auditor Lauren Franchak, who will be discussing findings related to Network Maryland. Eric, if you're able to pull up the slideshow, thank you.
There we go.
As of July 2022, DO-IT was responsible for overseeing 53 MITDPs valued at $2.9 billion. Slide 4 summarizes our primary findings and an overarching recommendation that DO-IT should assume greater responsibility to ensure MITDPs are completed on time, on budget, and within scope. For example, although DO-IT had some involvement with the MD Think project, DO-IT delegated significant responsibility to the Department of Human Services without ensuring DHS had sufficient resources and qualified personnel or contractors. Additionally, DO-IT did not assist with the selection of agency project managers or contractors, the development of contract specifications, and was not always familiar with the nature and scope of subsequent contract modifications. The delegation of these responsibilities were potentially detrimental to the success of the MITDPs and contrary to DO-IT's overall responsibility and purpose. In our opinion, this contributed to other findings in this report. For example, as noted in finding 2 on slide 5, DO-IT did not effectively monitor MITDPs to ensure they were on budget, on schedule, and scope and cost changes were appropriate. We reviewed certain aspects of 3 MITDPs with estimated costs totaling $1.47 billion and concluded that DO-IT did not always document its review and approval of annual agency project status reports prior to submitting them to DBM and DLS for budgetary purposes. DO-IT also did not obtain explanations for significant increases in cost, verify the accuracy of information reported in monthly health assessments, or review and approve changes in scope, cost, or schedule. For example, DO-IT was unable to explain why the estimated cost to complete for the MMIS2 and MD Think projects increased by over $1 billion. Similar conditions regarding the lack of sufficient documentation of project monitoring efforts have been commented upon in our 4 preceding audit reports dating back to November 2009. Moving on to slide 6, DoIT did not have an effective process to evaluate oversight project managers hired by vendors to assist with monitoring MITDPs, as the evaluations did not consider specific job duties or assess the OPMs in an observable, measurable, and objective manner. Finding 4, which is a repeat finding, is discussed on slide 7. Specifically, DoIT could not support cost data and conclusions included in its annual reports submitted to the governor, DBM, and General Assembly. Changes in schedule, cost, and other identified problems were not always included in these reports as required. For example, the annual report for the MD Think project stated there were no project risks, even though prior to submission, DoIT was aware of major issues with the project. Now I'll turn it over to Rob Wells, who will be discussing specific findings related to 2 MITDPs.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, members of the committees. As mentioned, my name is Rob Wells, and I was one of the audit managers on the most recent audit of the department. I will be briefly presenting findings 5 through 7. Slides 8, 9, and 10 discuss other oversight issues with 2 of the MITDPs we reviewed, MD Think and eMaryland Marketplace Advantage, or EMMA. As shown on slide 8 of the presentation, DoIT could not readily justify significant costs and implementation delays with MD Think. As of June 30, 2022, estimated costs for the project totaled $588.8 million, or a 254% increase from the originally planned $166.4 million. This included 17 contract modifications for scope and time extensions as of October 2022. Various concerns regarding development and management of the project were disclosed in both a forensic audit and independent verification and validation, or IV&V, reports. For example, concerns identified included the system design for one component not meeting the requirements of the state agency, which could lead to the component not being fully adopted. Furthermore, project leaders did not develop plans with sufficient detail to determine feasible completion dates, resulting in slippage. While the forensic report generally focused on the roles of DHS and MDH for MD Think, we believe the report highlights the need for more direct oversight by DoIT, which has sufficient information technology expertise and knowledge. On slide 9, our review of IV&V reports shows that IV&V reports issued from January 2020 through May 2022 identified 251 issues, including 29 high-risk issues. As of May 2022, 33 of the 251 issues were open, including 15 high-risk issues. Although high-risk issues require immediate action, 14 of the 15 high-risk issues had remained open from 3 to 27 months. Not addressing critical issues identified by the IV&V timely can lead to a project not being fully implemented, functional, not meeting scheduled goals, or exceeding budgets. Due to many implementation issues, the Joint Chairman's report requires DHS to provide a status report on MD Think by December 15th. Finding 7 shown on slide 10 noted additional oversight deficiencies during the development and implementation of EMMA, resulting in significant delays and changes to the cost and scope of the project. No formal action was taken by DoIT to resolve project issues noted in monthly health assessments or open items from the IV&V report. For example, the IV&V report noted a lack of both an overall integrated schedule for project tasks and sufficient dedicated staff. According to DoIT's fiscal year 2023 annual report of MITDPs, EMMA is estimated to be completed in fiscal year 2026 with a cost totaling $70.9 million, an increase of $32.7 million over the original contract cost. Thank you. I will now turn it over to Lauren to present some of our Network Maryland issues.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, co-chairs and members of the committee. I am Lauren Franchak, and I was one of the senior auditors for this audit of DoIT, and I will be covering the Network Maryland contract. DoIT awarded a new $74.7 million 7-year contract to the incumbent vendor to maintain Network Maryland. The vendor is to provide management and operations services relating to data networks and support, security, network engineering, fiber optic construction, design, engineering, and repair for Network Maryland. In addition, Other state agencies may use the Network Maryland vendor for specific staff resources in order to augment current agency staff. For finding 8, DoIT used the Network Maryland contract to award significant work unrelated to Network Maryland without considering a competitive procurement process. DoIT's use of the Network Maryland vendor for staff augmentation, both for DoIT and other state agencies, circumvented competitive procurement and control agency oversight for these services. Specifically, DoIT effectively sole-sourced 14 work orders for staff augmentation, totaling $16.8 million as of January 2023, and therefore bypassed the need for BPW approval, which is required for contracts valued over $200,000. Additionally, DoIT could have used its existing Consulting and Technical Services, or CATS Plus, master contract to procure these services, but BPW approval would be required for work orders greater than $200,000. DoIT advised us that this would have resulted in additional time delays before work could proceed. DoIT also used the Network Maryland contract for cybersecurity remediation services, which is the process of identifying and fixing information technology security threats. This may not have been the preferred method to complete this work. Specifically, in November 2022, DoIT management requested its legal counsel to review the work orders due to concerns about using the Network Maryland contract for cybersecurity remediation services. DoIT's counsel stated that the contract documents clearly identify work related to Network Maryland as the primary focus, and that if consulted prior to the event, counsel would have recommended that DoIT use another contract vehicle. DoIT also advised us that it had concerns regarding a perceived low BPW approval rate for emergency procurements, so it decided not to use this available procurement method for these services. As of January 2023, DoIT has approved the use of 11 cybersecurity remediation work orders totaling $25 million. Now moving on to the next slide for finding 9. For finding 9, DoIT did not adequately monitor work orders for agency staff augmentation services under the Network Maryland contract, and documentation of certain work orders could not be provided. For example, DoIT did not adequately verify amounts paid from 3 work orders totaling $9.1 million for staff augmentation at the Maryland Department of Health. Specifically, DoIT paid the vendor invoice based on timesheets submitted with the invoice without verifying with MDH that the work was completed and hours billed were reasonable. One payment, totaling $467,000, included charges for 40 hours of training, which was not authorized under the work order. Additionally, we noted that DoIT did not maintain accurate records of work orders, was unable to provide documentation for certain work orders, did not have records of all subcontractors, and did not approve certain work orders. Now moving on to the next slide for finding 10. For finding 10, DoIT issued the cybersecurity remediation work orders that were not sufficiently detailed and did not adequately ensure that amounts invoiced related to work performed. Specifically, work orders did not correlate estimated costs to specific deliverables or progress to improve the level of DoIT cybersecurity, and many deliverables were not clearly defined. Additionally, DoIT did not ensure labor hours billed were accurate, the related work was completed, or that hours billed were proper and supported. Furthermore, DoIT could not readily provide sufficient documentation that the work performed in relation to the hours billed adequately supported the propriety of the amounts invoiced. In some cases, the timesheets just referred to attending meetings, which DoIT could not adequately support. Similar concerns were noted in an independent assessment of these cybersecurity remediation efforts issued by a third-party DoIT contractor in February 2023, which concluded that for certain vendor work, the resources were estimated for implementation activities without a clear understanding by DoIT and the vendor for the scope of the work. The assessment also noted there was a lack of clarity on the reasonableness of the cost without having defined implementation activities. DoIT issued a stop work order effective May 31st, 2023, after approximately $11.5 million was expended for cybersecurity remediation work. Certain cybersecurity related findings will be discussed in the closed session. On slide 14, mentions other findings not specifically discussed today. Slide 16 summarizes conclusions related to the findings discussed so far. We'd be happy to take any questions from the committees at this time.
Thank you to Mr. Tan and your team for that overview and presentation about the audit report. If there are members of the committee that would like to ask questions, if you could raise your virtual hand. And just bear in mind that we also have an opportunity to ask questions of the department immediately after this. These are questions specifically to our legislative audit team. And I think I'll start off with a question here. I think you touched upon this earlier, but there were instances that I think that you documented that it seemed as though the department was aware that either some assessments had not been done, or that the risk of certain projects not being completed on time or not meeting certain objectives was high, and yet the documentation submitted to the General Assembly, to the Governor's Office, perhaps the DBM, seemed to either downplay that or totally omit that. Is that correct? And could you just touch on those instances where it seems like, the department didn't provide complete and accurate information to the reporting branches to be able to have proper oversight over the work that DoIT was doing?
Senator, that's a great question. I'll be happy to answer it. I'm Matt Street. I'm one of the directors within our Compliance and Performance Audit Division. From a reporting standpoint, the report that goes to the General Assembly, the Governor's Office, and DBM is a high-level review of all the MITDP projects. Could it be more, granular in detail? I think so, especially when it comes to significant projects like MD Think. That was one of the ones that we highlighted in our presentation in our audit report, where they were aware of definite risks, and they weren't always forthcoming in that report about what those risks were, especially the one of the findings that we have about the IV&V report. There was long-standing risks that hadn't been addressed, very, very high-level concerns with project management, project schedule, scope changes, and that was not clearly delineated in that report that goes to the Governor's Office and to the General Assembly.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That makes it difficult for the legislature and also for the Governor's Office to have a full assessment and picture of what some of these projects are doing and how they're going if there's information that the department knows that's not actually accurately being reported to either of us. It sounds like it's misleading by incompetence at best or misleading by intention at worst. And that makes it really difficult for us to have proper oversight of the department. I see Co-Chair Kaiser has her hand up. Delegate Kaiser, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Lamb. I have a question, and maybe it's because as one of the Cyber Joint Committee members and not an Audit Committee member, I don't have the context or range of the challenges of these audits. But hearing all these details today, it sounds pretty awful. And so I'm trying to get an understanding of how bad it is, maybe in comparison to what happens with other agencies. And I heard numbers like 1 billion when it came to Maryland Think. So I'm just trying to get a sense of, are you thinking there was any malfeasance or merely a lack of leadership at the top?
So as I think I mentioned in my earlier comments, and I think you'll hear a little bit more from the department, there seems to be a difference of opinion on DoIT's role in overseeing this. And again, I want to be clear that the administration that we're talking about are not the people who are going to be presenting today. It's talking about the previous administration, and clearly their approach was, let's delegate this to state agencies and let them have primary responsibility. I think if you read the report and some of the details that are in there, it's abundantly clear that the red flags were there. DoIT themselves had hired contractors to go and monitor some of these projects. Those contractors that they paid for then reported back, hey, we have some significant concerns, and sufficient action was not taken to address those concerns. So it's a balance between, we're looking at malfeasance. I can't. Intent is something that's very difficult to prove. I think really it was more of a mindset. And throughout the findings, you also see that the staffing levels, were raised in some of the responses to some of the findings, or at least during the course of our interview with some of the Do It personnel. But I really think the overlying issue was we have take MD Think for example. We're talking about a project that is going to cross over multiple state agencies, and it was delegated by previous administrations to DHS to go and administer. And so the question becomes, when you have a project like that, the size of which probably is unprecedented in the state from a procurement thing, what should Do It's role be in administrating those contracts? And that is, I think, what the legislation that we talked about earlier today, I think that is probably what needs to change going forward. And there is a concept of some things are just too big, and maybe we need to break this down and make sure we're getting successful implementation of parts before we continue to expand and grow. And as you can see from the description that my team just mentioned, the contract price kept growing and growing at the same time where we were continuing to see deficiencies not being addressed. And there needs to be an opportunity and a little bit more transparency with the legislature and others to make sure that when that's occurring, we are able to say, stop. Do we want to continue expanding this contract before we know that we're going to have a successful implementation of the pieces therein? And I think when the department comes up, they'd be in a good position to tell you where we stand, address the forensic report, which identified some pervasive problems with the system that's currently, it's operating, but not to the functionality that it was intended. I think they would be in a better position to talk about what their goal is to change going forward.
Thanks, Brian. I just wanted to, I think, re-emphasize the point that that Chair Kaiser mentioned, and I know that you all have put out there. But I think especially dealing with where we are with the state budget and the shortfalls that we're going to see and the difficult choices that we're going to have to make, I just wanted to ask you to re-emphasize just on these two programs, on the MD Think and the eMaryland Marketplace. What did we see as a cost overrun?
Matt?
I don't have those specific numbers at my fingertips. The problem, one of the things that runs into is the department will re-baseline projects. So that changes the goalpost, so to speak. And it happens quite frequently on almost all the MITDPs. Sometimes they get re-baseline 2 or 3 times, meaning that we're saying, okay, this was the original budget. We're going to throw more money at it. We're going to give more money because we need to keep expanding the scope, or we're behind schedule. We need more resources. So it's hard to actually define what was the original scope and cost and what it is now. But within our audit report, we did have, hold on, I don't have it. My team has it in front of them. I know MD Think went significantly. I mean, we have the figure 3 in our project or in our report that says, it started at 166 million. It's now at 500 and some million, sorry. And that's just through many modifications that have come along and made MD Think continue to, add scope and add different applications to it and functionality to it.
Matt, I didn't mean to trip you up. The number that you guys have in the audit report just on MD Think and eMaryland Marketplace is 1.03 billion in increased costs with a billion. So that's a lot of money that I think many of us would have much rather seen reinvested in the actual programs that these IT programs are meant to support, rather than failed procurements and massive extensions. So didn't mean to trip you up on that one.
I think what Matt was trying to get across is there's a variable in there. It's not just one invoice, we paid more than this amount. It's a combination of expansion of those contracts to do more or to add. And what we were looking for is, give us the breakdown. Explain how you got from this dollar amount to that. What service did we get for the additional cost with the contracts? And that's what we're saying in the report. They were unable to provide us with that level of detail. which raises some concerns about, how effective the use of our dollars were.
But to your point, the report, didn't, your findings were that the department didn't always have a clear scope of work, or the departments involved didn't have a clear scope of work. So as you point out, and as Mr. Street pointed out, there's tremendous mission creep, right? And, rebasing, which is really just moving the goalposts along because certain benchmarks weren't met. But yet on top of that, when it comes to a program like MD Think, we haven't seen the end of it. It's still not, quote, working according to DHS. And it seems like we're just kind of a bottomless pit of money that's being spent on MD Think to get it to work to a point that we're not even sure where that should be because we don't have the goalposts locked into one place.
Agreed. And I think what we were looking for was something to say, show us the success stories. Tell us this is what we paid for. This is what we anticipated paying for this module. This is what we got, and this is the ultimate cost. And that level of granularity, which doesn't sound very granular at all, is something that we weren't able to get. Otherwise, quite honestly, we would have included something like that in the report to share. And maybe the department could provide a little bit more insight today as to where that project stands. But that was the concern. You're right. The terms were a little vague. Scope was a little vague, and it was very difficult for us to kind of grasp what exactly were we paying for, and more importantly, when you had all these contract modifications, what additional value were we getting to justify those increased costs?
Delegate Aaron's, see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairs. Just an observation. I mean, we go through this each time on all these audits, and I think Delegate Kaiser mentioned something about malfeasance, and I thought that's an interesting point. And if you notice, every 4 years or 4 to 8 years, we replace all these secretaries, and that's an admirable thing. But in the real business world, we actually hire people to do this job, and they're held accountable on an annual basis through a board of directors or whatever. We don't seem to have the clout to actually do this, so we go through these audits, and it's kind of frustrating to see it each time we have a repeat here, a repeat there, and we blame it on the previous administration. I've seen this with O'Malley, now Hogan, and I'm sure we'll see it when Governor Moore's finished. But would there be any interest in the committee? Is there any way we could recommend saying that, let's quit doing these appointments and let's hire people that actually know the job very well, run a business, and can run it as a business unit as opposed to a government unit? Is that something we as an audit committee can recommend?
I mean, I think Delegate Aaron's, it sounds like you may have just volunteered yourself for our work group on.
Well, I don't mind doing the work group, Chair, but I mean, this is something I go through this every meeting, and I sit down and we always have the conversation about accountability. And for us to sit down and pick on people who actually come in to do a job, we get secretaries. It's not fair to them. I mean, first of all, these are very good people we're putting in a position where to win it is a very difficult thing. And if we would change our dynamic and take a look at this and say, gee, this is actually something we need to do. We have a point A and we got to get to point B, and there is accountability. There's very little accountability at this level because we do it every 4 years or every 6 years when we audit, and we sit back and say, you did this, they did that, and there's no one's ever losing a job. Nobody's ever coming and being held accountable and sat back and say, this is going on your resume. And this is something we are hired. We're using taxpayers' money to do this, and we're wasting it. I mean, every time we go through these hearings, we see the word, and you use the word billions. We listen to the word billions, and that's a lot of money we're using, the taxpayer dollars. That's why I volunteer. I gladly do it, but I'd like to see we could actually get some results out of it.
Well, I think in the scope of at least the Department of Information Technology, I think that's what our recommendations can lay out. That maybe there are I think we want to clearly define what the oversight capacity of DoIT is, maybe work with them to clearly define certain roles and certain positions so that we, at least in this instance, don't have a repeat in 4 or 8 years.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
And to your point, and maybe Secretary Savage can address this in her presentation, the secretary does turn over based on, who might be serving in that position, the administration at the time. But there are also executives and management at the department itself, right? And, I'm curious how many of the folks that were there previously are still there now while some of these findings were taking place and while there seemed to be some misreporting going back to DBM and to the General Assembly and to the governor's office. So, you know, it would be interesting to hear how much remains of management in the department when all these concerns have been brought up. Any other questions from the committees? All right, seeing no further questions for our audit team, why don't we go ahead and bring up Secretary Savage from the Department of Information Technology, and you have your team as well.
Well, good afternoon. I had prepared remarks based on the discussion. I'm trying to reorient where to pivot. You know, just I'll start. I'll go a little off my script here and address the last comment that was made about appointments. Yeah, I think first we have to recognize that we elect the governor, who in turn elects his staff, and that's, you know, that is how our process works. I will note that I do agree that in particular, IT secretaries nationwide have not historically been IT experts. My predecessor was a real estate attorney. In connecting with other state CIOs, the attorney expertise has been historically favored by governors around the country because we've thought of IT as contract management. We've thought of it as, I am your central point to buy you your cloud, buy you your software, buy you your hardware, and it's all about the negotiation. And so while I think, you know, I think Governor Moore has done an incredible job, not just with me, but with all of the cabinet secretaries, finding people who are truly expert in their field. And I think we should entrust him to do that. I will note that you're correct in saying that often we have, and not just Maryland, but many states have put the wrong type of expertise into this position because we've thought of it as IT is more of a negotiation than people who have real experience in IT. I will say, you know, I'm happy to share my resume with anyone. I've been doing IT and software development for 15 years. So I'm happy to share that if anyone would like to see, you know, my credentials. I will also address the point about the leadership team. With the exception of my deputy, who is continuing to serve in the chief operations role, there is no one remaining from the prior administration leadership. Once again, you know, I think the model in the previous administration was about contract management and negotiation and not about technology vision. So one of the things I will talk about today, you know, is the fact that I have dramatically transformed the leadership team because I do think that you know, change has to come from the top. So I'll pivot back to, you know, a bit of what I prepared, but, you know, I did just want to note that, you know, I think expertise and the expertise that, you know, you're recommending is a real thing and has been a challenge, not just in Maryland, but nationwide from what I've observed, both, you know, both in terms of what I inherited and also what I see in speaking with other CIOs around the country. So, you know, Chairman Lamb and Chairman Solomon and members of the committee, again, my name is Katie Savage. I'm the secretary at the Department of IT. We appreciate the opportunity to brief you today on the progress to address our audit findings. I do want to thank the team at OLA who worked with our staff during the audit process. The audit, as has been mentioned, covers the 3 years prior to my leadership in the department. I came in with Governor Moore in January of 2023. And as a new cabinet member and a new state employee, you know, I'd previously been in the Department of Defense working for the Secretary of Defense in an IT position for 4 years. I found the audit process enlightening as I sought to understand my department's challenges and opportunities. The audit that was just presented was very helpful in augmenting my roadmap for modernizing the department and expanding our remit as a contract management organization, which again, I think it has been typical of states around the country, to statewide technology leaders. Today, I do want to discuss the specific steps we are taking or in the process of undertaking to address the audit findings. I can't underscore enough. I hope your other takeaway from our conversation today will be the focus on new leadership with specific accountability for critical functions. Since taking office, not only have I turned over the entire leadership team, but I've added several new offices to modernize DoIT, and in so doing, remediate these findings. So to highlight some of those offices before we dive into the findings, I think the most pertinent office that I've created relevant to the discussion is the brand new Maryland Digital Service Team. I was surprised. It didn't even occur to me, frankly, to ask Governor Moore during the interview process, would there be software engineers? I just assumed, an IT department would have a software team. It did not. So I created the position of Chief Digital Experience Officer, Marcy Jacobs. She was my peer. While I ran the United States Digital Service Team at the Pentagon, she ran the Digital Service Team at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Marcy has in turn hired 5 senior digital service experts and 2 accessibility experts who will oversee the major major IT development projects, both the audits as well as how we can support agencies in intervening sooner, as was one of the recommendations. In addition to Marcy's team, I have created not one, but 2 chief technology officer positions. So one chief technology officer position oversees enterprise platforms, as well as identity and access management. The other will oversee our 2 statewide networks. So we talked a lot today about Network Maryland. We also oversee Maryland First, which is our radio network. We have a brand new CISO, Greg Rogers, who has added, which again was one of the recommendations, a governance, risk, and compliance organization to oversee security policy. He has also added an incident response team to better detect and mitigate cybersecurity events. We have a COO function where there was not, who has added dedicated contract and vendor management functions. Lastly, both the chief data officer and the chief privacy officer are now dual reports to myself and to Governor Moore. I'm tremendously pleased with the progress that these leaders have made, many of whom have joined only in the past year, and we've already accomplished a lot. And back to the point that was made about expertise and appointments, all of these individuals could be making 2 or 3 times what they are at the state to do this work. We're all here not because we want the salary, not the salary, or we want the resume padding. We're all here, and I hired people who are here because they're deeply passionate about this work. We all recognize that we inherited an IT organization that was not really an IT organization. It was really more, again, about contract management, and arguably didn't do that very well. And we're all passionate about charting a course for a modern Maryland. So with that, I'll dive into what we tend to do to address the findings. So first, findings 1 through 7, as was noted, address major IT development projects. Most of my career has been in software development and legacy system modernization. I did this for the city of Chicago for almost 10 years. Then I was at the Department of Defense for 4 years, and now I'm in Maryland. So I've done legacy modernization, city, state, and federal. And I greatly appreciated the findings from OLA. There's a lot that I agree with. And I will summarize the findings to say oversight was ineffective. I agree with that. And further, DoIT was not staffed to intervene when a project was off track. I think those findings are accurate. And it's why I created the Maryland Digital Service and hired Marcy, as I mentioned earlier, as the state's first Chief Digital Experience Officer. So MDDS, as we're calling the Maryland Digital Service, will be sort of working through our legislatively mandated oversight function. So Marcy and I have observed, just to touch on oversight for a moment, Marcy and I have observed that oversight has really introduced to our agencies a heavy burden of paperwork that's really focused on project management. That is to say, is the project on time and on schedule, without the focus on product management, which is ensuring that the product is delivering the intended value to both end users and the state itself. It doesn't matter if it's on time or on budget if it doesn't do what we need it to do. So we are working to reform our criteria and processes to ensure the factors that we are auditing are actually impactful and not just a lot of paperwork. And if followed, will increase the likelihood of projects delivering their intended value to users and the state, and ensure that we use the state's resources responsibly. So for example, a lot of the criteria that we look at right now really speak to vendor schedules. What I want to see, I think this point was made earlier, did you produce an MVP or a minimum viable product? With the money we give you, a much smaller amount in year one, what were you able to produce? What is your roadmap? Did you do a period of discovery? Did you talk to users? So there's a lot that we'll be looking for in terms of reforming the audit process. Separately, and I do want to know this distinction, it is separate from oversight. I think they're very different functions. There's the audit of the project, and then there's the intervention on a project. Separately, MDDS will engage to support prioritized MITDPs. So we are not fully resourced to intervene on all failing projects. We just received 10 pins because I advocated for them July 1. So we've had 10 pins for 2 months. So we are in no way resourced for all failing projects in the state. However, I think that a combination of better auditing, so we have fewer failing projects, and slowly building up this engineering team that I mentioned that can focus on these failing projects will help us to move towards projects that are user-centered, deliver critical functionality to the state. So for those projects, and we have, Emma notably is one of them, that we didn't fund it in last year because it was off track. So if you look at the funding for it, you will note that last year Emma received no new funding. So we do tend to intervene in a way that we hadn't been able to fully before. We do tend to press pause or even fully stop some of these projects. But for those projects that either the governor's office has said you must continue, or we all agree, it's something like payroll modernization that the state absolutely needs, we will intervene by bringing Marcy's team to bear, which is bringing user-centered design, product management, and engineering skill sets. Lastly, just to note, product intervention doesn't always mean that we, and likely will not mean that we manage the project. It could mean that we get involved up front on the discovery piece of it. Are we solving for the right thing? It could mean that we get involved in technical solutioning. Is this the right piece of software to solve this problem? And in rare cases where an agency might be incredibly small, understaffed, there might be a long-term delivery model where we do provide ongoing project management support. But again, with limited resources, we have to think through, a sustainable model for supporting projects and what our priorities can and should be. Before I move off of findings 1 through 7, I do just want to touch on MD Think. I noted with Emma that we did press pause on funding for that, and Marcy's team has been heavily engaged. That was not part of the audit period, so it's new since that has happened, but Marcy's team has been heavily engaged with DGS on Emma. With regard to MD Think, I do want to clarify this idea that it's like a bottomless money pit, because I think people don't understand what MD Think is. MD Think is cloud. Like a lot of what we're buying for MD Think is hosting. We're paying Amazon to host applications. So the previous administration decided to modernize by lifting, what we call in the industry, lifting and shifting 100 applications from their servers and moving them into the AWS environment. And so a lot of what those costs are is really cloud services. It's not a project at all. That said, there is some application, of those applications that were lifted and shifted into the environment. There has been quite a bit of money, as was noted, funneled into trying to make those applications perform better. And that is something that Marcy and I tend to get engaged in, because I agree that we need a more sustainable model for how we fix those applications. But I do want to distinguish that MD Think will always be a large cost, not something that we can't bring down over time, but there are kind of two pools of funding that we're talking about here. We're talking about cloud services, which is something we will always have to pay for. You have to pay, a cloud provider to host your applications. And then there's the contractor piece. And I agree, and I think this was noted as part of the forensic audit. There was, with DHS as the operator, there was, by the previous administration, mismanagement of the contractors who were working on those applications. And that is something that Marcy and I can work on to help intervene and make sure that the applications are not wastefully using contractors. So I do just want to distinguish that we're never going to see, a complete sunset of those costs, because to some extent it's just paying for cloud services, which is something we would have to do anyway. And frankly, we were paying for with legacy systems previously. So with regard to findings 8 through 10, which address contract management, my understanding is that one or more do-it managed contract vehicles were used for other state missions than intended. My understanding is that this was further accelerated by the panic caused by the pandemic. Further, the contracts lacked policies and procedures for monitoring vendor performance. OLA noted that in 2023, there was a stop work order issued. I take full responsibility for issuing all those stop work orders. I too looked at it and said, I don't understand what we're getting for this money. So I have been going through looking at each contract and trying to sunset those that were inappropriate. Further, under my leadership, and this new COO function, we've centralized contract management under our newly created Deputy Secretary and COO. So by centralizing contract management across our agency, we've been able to put the appropriate safeguards in place to ensure newly created policies and procedures are followed. These policies and procedures will ensure that subcontractors are approved and qualified per the terms of the contract, and that labor hours are billed accurately for work completed and properly supported. Further, we're making sure and taking great pains to ensure that the Network Maryland contract in particular is only used for the network and not as inappropriately used as my understanding was during the pandemic. I will skip some of the findings that were noted that we'll have to take offline for a confidential session and jump to finding 15. So finding 15 was with regard to the agency MOU. So our operations team is addressing the lack of formal written agreements with do-it executive agencies via an MOU. I'm really proud of this work because not only did we overhaul the memorandum of understanding with our agencies, but one, we brought the executive agencies into the process. So we allowed the IT leaders, one of the things I did since starting is once a quarter, I bring together all of the IT leaders from each agency. And we talk about where are we going as a state with regard to IT. This is something that the previous administration did not do. So I've allowed the IT leaders to be part of the conversation. And over the past several sessions, we've allowed them to review the MOU before we sent it out to their leadership for signature. And they were able to work with us to make sure that the language was appropriate. Further, even further than the MOU, I asked the team to overhaul our entire product and service catalog. I can't underscore, and I'm sure they're cursing me, but I can't underscore what a big effort that was. The product and service catalog had not been overhauled in over 3 years. So even prior to this audit finding, we looked at the product and service catalog, everything we offer, whether it's network or cloud or software, top to bottom. We determined if anything is obsolete, redundant, or missing. So we totally revamped the product and service catalog. And we also worked with an external consultant to review our rates. So one, we made sure our rates are competitive with other states, which they are. And further, we updated those rates in an online platform that's transparent that every agency has access to. So currently, any agency can go in and see their rates for FY25. They can see what services we're providing, the rates, and how we're billing them. So not only did we address the recommendation to make sure that we have an MOU governing our arrangement, but there's a clean product and service catalog and matching rates. Lastly, for finding 16, to address the finding related to inventory, DO-IT has been working with DGS to conduct our physical inventory. But further, we also want to be able to take advantage of automated ways to be able to conduct this process. There's a number of software and commercial software that's available to do automated scanning to tag, different assets. So we're working with DGS to allow for that policy change so that we can take advantage of software which will tell us, everything that we have by way of statewide assets. Again, in conclusion, we did have additional findings that, due to their sensitive nature, will be addressed separately. But I want to underscore, the two chief technology officer positions, one for infrastructure that I mentioned, the other for platform and client services that I mentioned, which will ensure IT system security and inventory processes and procedures are accurately followed. As you will see, most of the recommendations given by OLA have been addressed with the actions taken by the new team. I'm really excited by the progress. Going back to the top of our conversation, I hope that I've created a role for myself, a role for the team, and have structured the organization in such a way that only a set of technologists can come in and run this organization. And I don't think that was true before. I think we've really made this a place where, you need to bring your engineering, your product management, your infrastructure expertise. And I think that, I like to think that after we all leave, only these roles could be filled by true experts. And we'll see better results better results because of it. And further, that we're better able to serve the state of Maryland, both the executive agencies in their missions, but ultimately the residents of Maryland. So with that, I'll pause and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Note to the committee, if you have questions, please raise your virtual hand, and then we'll go through in the order that we see the hands being raised. I'll kick it off and then pass along to Chair Solomon. Thank you for that presentation. I think you gave us a lot to think about here, and I'm struck by some of the comments that you made about what, at least to me, seems like a major shift in the mission of DO-IT. You mentioned having brought in a chief digital experience officer and some of the other processes that you're trying to implement within the department. But you also note that the department is not involved in the management of specific and major IT projects, that the department seems to be advising on user experience, on productivity, working with departments on what are you trying to produce? Did you talk to the users and do a discovery process and the like? And that seems to be a major shift in the mission of DO-IT. I think the intention of the legislature was to have DO-IT serve as the oversight body, as a top-level project management and oversight agency, especially on some of these large, major IT projects that span multiple departments and agencies like MD Think. And it sounds as though what you're saying is that that's not actually what you're envisioning the Department of Information Technology to do, that you don't have the people to do it, that you're not there to do project management, to work closely with each of these departments. And perhaps that explains why you requested legislation in the last legislative session to redefine what oversight is, to exclude many of the provisions that I think many of us would consider to be included within just broad oversight that you would do. So is the department trying to revisit its mission, the fundamental responsibilities of what DO-IT does, by rescoping or rebasing oversight?
So it's a great question, and it is why we sought some of the legislation to clarify it. I do think that there's a really important distinction to be made between the audit function and the intervention function. So in my view, and I think this was, going back to the presentation, which I appreciated, on the history of MIT DPs, the audit function does need to, I 100% agree, it needs to be improved. I think when I look at the history of the legislation, it wanted to ensure, good use of state's resources, and also that projects were, delivering a critical service. And I think the type of auditing that we did, didn't accomplish that. I mean, one, I think someone made the point of, the financials were just moving the goalposts down the line. And so, I don't think it was effective fiscal monitoring. And then from the documentation I've reviewed that we've collected over the years, it also wasn't, again, being a software developer for the last 15 years, it's not what I would look for in terms of a product roadmap either, So I do think that, a lot of these agencies have bigger IT staffs than we do. The Department of Health's IT team is bigger than my whole team, just for some perspective. So we do have limited resources, but regardless, setting resources aside for the moment, I do think we need to align on what it means to audit. And to me, part of auditing is looking for the right things, looking for how the project was initially scoped, for example. One thing I want our auditors to start looking at is, if you are presenting to me, say in year one, and I think Brian made this point earlier, if you're presenting to me a $15 to $30 million project in year one, that should be a red flag immediately by the auditors, because I want to see, what is the MVP you can produce with somewhere between $1 and $5 million. I think a lot of these projects, and again, as was noted by LA, can and should be scoped a lot smaller. What we say in technology is we think about it as what we would call a stage gate process. First, phase one is discovery. What are we actually building? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Phase two is, let's pilot something. Let's pilot. If we're looking at a new case management system, for example, for the Department of Human Services, can we work with a county, to pilot it, for example? 3 would be, what's the minimum viable product? What is it that we would need to put in the hands of caseworkers to be able, without all the bells and whistles, to be able to do their job? And then phase 4 is okay, let's scale it to, a few more counties or statewide. So I think, what I'm proposing is that our auditing function needs to align better to traditional product management. We need to refine the auditing function to be, frankly, what technologists would do, in the real world with regard to overseeing a product implementation. So I am proposing that not only do we think about auditing, not only do we think about the auditing function more tightly aligned to industry best practice, but what we saw in legislation was the ability to stop a project, to reduce their funding, if they kind of veer off that stage gate process. So, part 1 of this is absolutely we need to think about auditing and steering these projects in a different way. Part 2, there are some agencies, and I think DGS is a really great example. They don't have a CIO, they don't have technology expertise. Emma, the e-procurement system is something that we all need. And so it's not an option to let them kind of try and fail over and over again. So that is one where Marcy's team has already gotten really engaged in intervening. And so for those projects that kind of fall into that category of they don't have the expertise, it's a critical function for the state, I do think that whereas DoIT has historically not been staffed with either the right skills or a number of people, we should provide some intervention. So I think it's finding that balance between better auditing to help agencies steer themselves and their contractors, and intervening where it's become apparent that an agency can't be successful.
I guess just a follow-up from that, then, who do you believe has primary responsibility for these audit functions you identify? Is it DoIT or these individual agencies?
I think the audit function is us. And I think that's what legislatively, that's how I interpret the legislation. I think the audit function is us. I think the product management is the agency, and where our auditors start seeing their project management or product management off track, that's where we either need to, press pause on the project and or intervene in some way.
But the reports from the OPMs, the operational project managers, go to DoIT, right? So doesn't that mean DoIT has some responsibility over project management of these large IT projects that span multiple agencies?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I think the term is a little bit misleading, and we are going to actually just call the team auditors, because they're really not the product managers. I mean, the DoIT project managers, I think it's a misnomer. I mean, they're really looking at, they're really peering over the PM's shoulder at the agency to look at, did you pay your contractor on time? Are you going to need to rebaselining? They're not doing anything that I can tell you from experience has anything to do with technical oversight. So while they might have been providing these reports, they were not effective. So I think some of this too is just, to your point, refining those roles and responsibilities. What Marcy and I intend to do is to make it really clear for both current and go forward MITDPs is that you as the agency are responsible for hiring a PM who can solidly see this project from start to finish. My favorite word in the 2023 legislation that I made sure to add was capacity. Because I do think DoIT has, to your point, I think DoIT does have a role in evaluating their PM. Because I have seen, an agency put forward a PM who they tell me confidently can manage this start to finish. And I look at, their work product, and I can tell you that they're not a technical PM. So I do think we have a responsibility for making sure that the agency has the capacity and the right people. And if they don't, that is something our auditors should be picking up on. Hey, they have a non-technical person overseeing this project. We need to work with them to make sure they get someone capable over there.
So I think that's probably news to many of us. I would have assumed that since the operational project managers report to you and DoIT, that you have project managers that provide some high-level oversight. What you're describing seems a little bit different than probably what many of us had an impression of what oversight project managers were actually doing. Last question.
If you look at, sure, and just to build on that, I mean, if you look at and I think this has been the fundamental kind of mismatch. I mean, if you look at just the ratio, I think we have 8 project manager, 8 people who are really auditors, to a ratio of 50 plus MITDPs. So the expectation is really that we're going to be the PM. And I don't think it is. We would have to dramatically reduce the number of projects we were able to take on. It's just, there was this mismatch. I think DoIT had this expectation of 8 people can divide that portfolio amongst them and oversee, the project management without being the actual day-to-day PM, running sprints, overseeing the engineering team, looking at design, et cetera, and this big portfolio. So that is what we have to more closely align. If the expectation is that DoIT would truly project manage, all 50 MITDPs annually, we would need 50 project managers, and we're not resourced to do that right now. I think with a more competent auditing function, we could oversee agencies who bring their resources and a strong technical PM to the project, and then save our 8 people for those projects that really need the steer.
Okay, and last question here, because you mentioned it a few times, is that you don't believe that the department has the ability to deny funding for these ongoing IT projects if they decide that the funding should be curtailed, while OLA believes that you do have the statute authority to do this. Can you describe why there's a discrepancy here?
So my understanding was that in the prior administration, DoIT would recommend, as part of the annual budget process, that an agency not receive funding for their MITDP. and the agency would go around them to DBM and get it anyway as part of their general funds. So what we were trying to strengthen and did, successfully with this year's legislation is strengthen that ability to work with DBM to deny a project funding if and when it was not successful. So, I think it appeared it was there, but I think in practice it needed to be strengthened.
And you believe you have it now?
I do, and I think the test will really be, last year we did deny several agencies funding, and this year we're, going a step further, and we continue to sort of be more stringent with our funding as I learn more about agencies' capacity. Also, frankly, just as I work more closely with the administration, and believe I have a good understanding of the governor and his cabinet's priorities. And one of the interesting challenges as well with the current MITDP portfolio is that the projects that are MITDPs in the first place are not necessarily consistent. I think when I started, there was like everything from MD Thing to like a drone project. And I think, given the state's fiscal position, I want to, we're unfortunately not in a position where we can be doing superfluous projects. And so I think we want to make sure that everything that's in the MITDP portfolio, especially this year, is a critical state function. So I think it's even more important that we deny or kind of curtail funding this year to ensure that, especially given the state's financial position, we're only focusing on those projects that really add critical value to the state.
Great, thank you. Chair Solomon?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Lamb. And thank you, Secretary Savage, for being here and bringing your team. I think I just wanted to emphasize one point that Senator Lamb had made. Going back and looking at the definition of oversight that was in the departmental bill, HB 227 and Senate Bill 294 that we considered last year, I guess I am a little concerned that the definition of oversight as defined in this bill does not necessarily match up with what I'm hearing you describe. And I think I prefer what I hear you describe, especially with, with the new team, Maryland Digital Service under Deputy Secretary Jacobs. That to me strikes me as exactly sort of, maybe on a larger scale, but I think what many of us are thinking, that you all have sort of the IT expertise, and when an agency that may not have, the size and scope of the Department of Health is trying to do something, that you have a team of experts that can come in, put a stop on things, and essentially, become sort of the consulting team that comes in and fixes it. But that does not match up to me with what I see this definition of oversight, which says the obligation to monitor, assess, and report on the implementation and financial status of the major IT projects. And it says oversight does not include project or program management support or responsibility over project activities. And I understand that you may not want that on everything, and that may not be necessary, but I think, I know in the report back to OLA, on the update of audit findings, you all said you're working on legislative language for next session. I think we'd all be really curious, to see how that's progressing and work with you on it. Because again, I do not see what you've said match up with the definition that was in print in that bill, which ultimately didn't progress. May or may not be a starting point for where you all are next year.
No, I agree. I think last year, we tried to take a swing at making those definitions match up, and would love to continue to refine it. I think we're close. I think we're starting to make a lot of really good progress. And, I do want to underscore, I really think it's both. I do think we need a more successful auditing function that is in line with IT best practices. Our IT function, our auditing function is not there. I would envision a team of, auditors, if you will, that come from, software development backgrounds and could fluently pinpoint every single project with where it is in that kind of stage gate process that I was mentioning earlier. Like that's what we need in the auditing function. If it hasn't, if they're asking, there's some red flags up front. If they're asking for a ton of money in year one without clear deliverables, like that's the type of thing that we should be looking for. So I'd love to strengthen, that auditing really means that we're consistently looking at projects on, the best practice industry product journey, if you will, and tracking them and holding agencies accountable to that. Like, I think a really strong auditing function would take us a long way, because many of the agencies do have good IT staff, and I think with our, like, just this kind of a better audit function, we could be really efficient with our resources. And then we could save our fire, if you will, for the agencies that, some of these agencies are very small and they're not resourced for IT. I'll give an example of a project I really love. Marcy's done two, at least two, more than two, two interventions that I really love for the past year. And one was working with the Secretary of State on the ELF project. That was a custom development that's been going on for years. We worked with DC to just ask them what they use, and we're able to bring over their system. We kind of backed up and looked at, what do we actually need ELF to do? And we've, put that back on track. I mean, they're a team of 4 people, but they have, ELF is really impactful. So that's a good one to put our, the PMs we have in house on. Another one she worked on was with Veterans Affairs. Likewise, very small team. The majority of their staff are groundskeepers. It's not an IT powerhouse, but they administer the Veterans Trust Fund. And again, she worked with them to figure out, how could we use a commercial off-the-shelf product to be able to help them administer that. So, I want to save kind of with limited true product management resources, I want to save it for those projects and then fix our auditing function so we can steer the agencies that do kind of have the PM resources.
Great. I did have just one question before we move to the committee members. So, I think Chair Lamb mentioned this, and one of the pieces in the report that really stuck with me beyond some of the financial pieces. And again, I appreciate you saying that you've sort of cleaned house at the top, was the fact that in those annual reports, essentially DoIT knew through the independent verification and validation reports that things at MD Think were practically going off the rails.
Yeah.
And that there were a lot of findings that were not being rectified. And yet, again, despite the agency getting that information, 2 or 3 months before the annual report was issued, the annual report made it seem like things were wonderful. And I went back and looked at, some of those contract expansions were approved, obviously, by the Board of Public Works, but the public documents that were included in the BPW packet, they're 2 pages. And frankly, most of the language in there is boilerplate. It says approved without discussion. And there was very little, I'm not an IT expert by any stretch, but even if, if I had seen an audit report that said, we've got 50 outstanding violations here, issues that need to be rectified, that would have raised a red flag. And, I think as Chair Lamb mentioned, those annual reports are sort of the opportunity for, the broader community, the legislature and the audit folks to see that these aren't going right. And I mean, again, you can't go back and fix the mistakes of the previous administration, but what new systems have been put in place and how can we be sure that those annual reports that we're going to see going forward actually have the true information in them that you all are getting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really glad you raised it. So MD Think, as I was saying, was I think part of the reason it hasn't been transparent is that it's not one project. The previous administration chose 100 applications directionally in the Health and Human Services departments or related departments and lifted them into the MD Think environment. And part of the reason, and that was considered one MITDP. Well, that's not accurate, because what I think, that I will tell you, their secretaries are differently asking, and it sounds like, it's certainly, what Secretary Lopez shared with regard to saying, when Secretary Lopez says MD Think isn't working, what he means is that CJAMS, the Juvenile Management System, is not working, that CSMS isn't working, and then E&E aren't working. Those are his 3 applications. So one of the things that we're doing this year, and you'll see that as part of this year's ITIF budget, is that we are breaking out those projects in the budget themselves. So next year you won't see MD Think. It'll be the applications that are part of MD Think that have an ongoing cost. There are some, MHB has applications that again, and they're just paying for the cloud hosting. So that's that's an operational cost. But one of the things that we've already changed for next year to provide this transparency that you're talking about is for the applications that we're actively working on that are active projects, they'll be broken out by project. So you'll see CSMS, CJAMs, E&E, et cetera. Because I agree with you. I took a look at that. It's like, you know, this doesn't tell me anything, because I look at MD Think and I'm like, well, I can tell you half that cost is just AWS, you know, hosting costs, which, like, fine, we have to pay for that. But what I want to see is, like, how much are we spending for the contractors building these applications that Secretary Lopez says doesn't work? And, you know, Marcy's team can get in. That also allows us to, you know, as was suggested earlier, sort of bifurcate the problem, break it into smaller chunks, and say, rather than like MD Think doesn't work. Well, MD Think does work because it's hosted, you know, it's a cloud environment. What isn't working are those individual applications. So that also kind of allows Marcy to work with DHS directly on fixing these applications and, frankly, right-sizing the costs. I think there are a lot of developers, you know, attached to some of those applications. We need to right-size those teams, make them sustainable, and hand DHS back something that they can operate in perpetuity.
Great. No, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the first hand that I saw up was Delegate Harrison.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon. Thank you for everything to the auditors and to the agency. We have heard over time a number of issues. My question for you is, you're making a lot of changes. You got a brand new staff, and possibly the next administration is going to have another brand new staff, but it's the people of Maryland who are basically the end users of all of these products that we need to be concerned with. And so my question to you is, all of these changes that you're making, are you putting this in writing? Are there standard operating procedures so that in writing, so that the next person, the next group comes in, can pick it up and say, okay, this is what we have going on. This is what was done. And here is how we can move forward. And you just mentioned a few applications that seem to have some trouble. Are there standard operating procedures for that? And if not, are you putting them in place or ensuring that they're put in place?
I think it's a great point. And so we do want to make sure that each department and all of the new team that I've brought on board does document these as SOPs. Everything that I mentioned, whether it's the MOU process that I just described, that only takes place every 4 years. But, I want to make sure that, that the next secretary doesn't have to figure out how to, go through that MOU process again. So whether it's, how we operate our SOC, the auditing that I mentioned with regard to MITDPs, or the MOU process, we will be documenting these in SOPs. We also have a legislative mandate to update the IT master plan. And so that'll be an opportunity as well to, paint a roadmap of where we're going as a department. So I'm also hopeful that that'll be a document that can guide the next administration. The other piece that is on Marcy's team as well as part of digital experience, you mentioned Marylanders, is our website. The website right now doesn't necessarily display a lot of that information, and it's needed both for the agencies that we serve and for the general public. And so another undertaking that Marcy has is making sure that we can provide that information in a more transparent way via the website.
Thank you.
I think next we had Senator Hellman, followed by Senator Benson.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here and for your candor with us. I want to follow up, I guess, on Chair Solomon's questions about MD Think. And I understand what you're saying in terms of it being different pieces and those cloud hosting costs being built in. And it sounds like you're taking a very different approach from the prior administration who kind of launched this project. So if you could roll back time to 2017 and you were starting anew and look, we are $1 billion down the road here, what would you do differently?
Oh my gosh, this is the best question. I think I give an answer to this every day. I mean, I never would have lifted it. So there's a lot of problems with the way it was operationalized. So one, I understand the impetus to move legacy applications, to modernize legacy applications. You know, first, like full stop, like understand the need to do that. I think the prior administration's misunderstanding was that modernization meant this lift and shift. You will move it into a cloud environment and, you know, your application will work. And what they missed by doing 100 at once was the opportunity to reimagine them and to make sure that they work correctly. Like one of, there was, I will say too, that we're actually down to like 80 something. We have deprecated a number of them because some of them were lifted and shifted into the environment without even looking at the users. I mean, I will say I found an application that the DHS secretary, not the current one, previous, was the only user. So we had an application for one person. So, you know, we are going through and kind of eliminating those types of things. But, you know, to your question, if I could go back and do it over again, I would absolutely not do 100 at once. You know, I would look at what are the ones that need to be reimagined, are truly legacy systems. So CJAMS is a great example, you know, how we manage juvenile cases on behalf of DHS. Rather than just lift and shift that, I would have done a proper discovery, you know, met with DHS users, try to understand what problem they're trying to solve, you know, and then built it correctly in that environment. The other things that I would have sequenced after that, in which we're doing now retroactively, are looking at what common populations some of these applications share. So like E&E, for example, you know, enrollment and eligibility is kind of is sort of the program that we use to determine, you know, SNAP, WIC, TANF, et cetera. I would have looked at like, maybe that's the one of the first or second ones that we do. And again, instead of just lifting and shifting, let's figure out what we need to work and what data we need as part of it. How do we export it so that all other benefits programs can build on that? So, and to answer your question, I would have looked at the most impactful projects, done them in a more sequenced approach, and reimagined them before just lifting and shifting them. The other thing that I would have done differently, and we're trying to undo at the state, is a lot of the applications were not only legacy that were lifted and shifted, but they were custom development. And this is something I saw at DoD as well. I think for a couple of decades, you know, IT companies sold governments on this need for highly customized software. And some of it too is just that the environment has changed. We have a lot of low code, no code, software as a service, you know, and or, you know, commercial software products that we can buy. And so I think the other thing that I would have done is said, do we really need a custom development for this? Or, you know, something like Salesforce sufficient? Is something, you know, whatever it is. And so I also think one of the challenges I've seen in Maryland today, especially with a lot of the legacy applications, is that they are custom. And I think we want to start slowly undoing that. You know, so I mentioned one of the CTO positions for platform and client services, Jason Silva, who's joined the team. And he is creating a software as a service, low code, no code team that can provide some of those products. So we don't end up in this like, you know, $10 million custom application world that we live in now.
So just as a follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chairman, so thank you, and I appreciate that. It seems like a very, very different approach than your predecessors, but here we are, millions and millions of dollars down the road, and I'm just would be interested in your thoughts about sort of the accountability for those decisions that were made at that time, and was that totally wasted money? Now that you're, I mean, if I read between the lines, you're coming in to fix things that were.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the way I think about the MDThink platform right now, and I'll try and not get too deep in the weeds here. I do actually think, and I've looked at the kind of core, I've looked at the core offering as a cloud service, and at its core, it is what we call platform as a service. It is a good environment for agencies to have a secure environment to host their applications, whether it's, it's CJAMs or, any of those applications. So I actually do think it was a good investment in a platform, in a cloud environment. And we've worked, especially since starting, myself and the executive director for MD Think have worked very, very closely with Amazon as the provider, the cloud provider for MD Think. We've worked very closely with them to ensure that the platform itself is healthy, that you can store data securely, and they've helped us even with. Given that there is so much data in it, they've helped us do things like build a customer 360 profile. So if someone is in it and you see that, they touch a number of applications, they're a juvenile in this system, they're part of another family benefits program. They've helped us look at that data and treat that person as one case or one individual. So I do think there's a lot of quality behind the platform. And I will say, having come from DoD, it's actually not a very custom environment. I mean, it is pretty, what we'd say open source. It is a cloud environment with a lot of commercial software tools that you can use to build applications. So I do think it was a good investment from that perspective. I do think that there are, a number, I'd be hard pressed to put an exact number on it, but of the 83 applications that are still in it, I do think there's a healthy amount that are being hosted, and that's fine. They're running, they're running sufficiently. I do think, to your point, where the waste comes in is there are those major applications, like I just mentioned, like CGMs, CSMS, et cetera, that really need some love, and they're not working as intended. They weren't working as intended. They're custom software. And so I think that's the part where we have to, where I don't think that the money was spent as well as it could have been to, kind of custom build them in this environment.
Thank you.
All right, Senator Benson. Senator Benson, I think you need to unmute. There you go.
First of all, I want to thank the Secretary for our presentation. I know that this is quite a heavy load for you, but it's a heavier load for us as elected officials, and because we have to take care of the money that's given to us here in the great state of Maryland. So I know it's a tremendous responsibility. I'm very happy to see where you all have placed a lot of emphasis on repeat findings. I was particularly concerned about a repeat finding number 4. I was very pleased about that. Let me ask 2 questions. Number 1, do you feel that you have adequate staffing to do the job? That's number 1. And number 2 is, what can we do as elected officials to help not only you, but to help you all with this tremendous responsibility? Because if I look at this report, to be honest with you, at some point in time here, it does cost us, many of us who care about the great state of Maryland, which all of us do, in fact, causes us a little heartburn to see what has happened to a lot of the money that was entrusted to us as elected officials. And we are out to take care of the taxpayers and to be sure that there's transparency and accountability for the money that we receive. Can you tell me how closely also are you working with the audit department? Do you all meet? What kind of relationship do you all have? Can you answer those questions for me, please?
Sure. No, I appreciate those questions, and thank you for your kind remarks. It it is an awesome responsibility, but as I've shared with the governor, I really enjoy this job. It's been just really wonderful, to be able to build this team. It is a lot of work. It is a big transformation, but it's been really wonderful, to have the governor's support in transforming this agency. And I've been able to bring on board tremendous people that I really love and respect, and I feel like we're going in a good direction. To answer your questions about resources, I think it's a combination. My understanding is that over the years, DO-IT has gone back and forth in terms of being a centralized organization or a decentralized organization. And sometimes we see that. We sometimes see, again, that there might be huge IT staffs at some of the other departments that outweigh ours. And so I do think, a fresh look at how we could further centralize some of those resources at DO-IT, and kind of, further commit one way or the other. Not that everything has to be fully centralized. And I do think we want to preserve some ability for the agencies to run their missions the way that they see best. But I do think we want to kind of reimagine how we might get more IT resources aligned to DO-IT. So a good example of that we're putting in place because of the incredible cybersecurity legislation that we have is our Information Security Officer program. So what we're doing there, because we have the funding to do it, is Greg Rogers, who's the new CISO, will hire and oversee information security officers that are assigned to various agencies. So they report into him, but they have the ability to influence, the security functions at agencies. And I'd love to see more of that, across our other functions, this kind of hub and spoke model, which I think works really well. If Marcia is digital service expert, digital service officer, had someone like station, an agency resource that was assigned to her, for example, I think that would be incredible. So, I'd love to see more of that hub and spoke model that designates DO-IT as the authoritative source while still, preserves an agency resource who really knows their business. So I think we could be more creative with regard to that. I think, you also asked, what can the legislature do? I think helping us, further cement the centralization piece would be tremendously helpful. Continuing to cement, our authority. The other piece is always procurement, which I don't think I have to mention to this group, but we do have to find a balance between ensuring that we are responsible with our dollars, while also not making it so difficult to get IT resources. So looking at, the BPW threshold of $200,000, that might be like one or two people. So every time you need an engineer, you have to go to BPW and you're waiting for that for months. So, a fresh look at procurement reform is always welcome to help us get in the IT resources that we need to support projects, whether it's with engineering or design or web, much faster. I think your last question was about, how we work with the auditing team. And I've been really fortunate, I think, to work with OLA closely through this process, as well as DBM's auditing function. We've been meeting, I think, weekly at this point to make sure that we're addressing all these findings, because I do take them very seriously. And as I said in the beginning, I do think it was a really helpful, part of the roadmap of putting together my roadmap as I took over the agency.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Benson. I think we have a question from Senator Hester, who's on the phone.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Fabulous. Well, first of all, Secretary Savage, thank you. It was a pleasure to work with you and your team over the 2024 session.
Yeah.
I was curious about the Maryland Digital Services and the either 8 or 10 new pins that you just got. And I'm kind of thinking about that in relationship, to the question that Senator Benson just asked. I mean, I feel like we keep going back and forth about project management and accountability. And we've seen that small agencies don't have the staff to be an effective project managers. We've also seen, I think, that the large agencies may have staff, but not necessarily the same kind of capacity that DoIT could bring to manage the projects. And when a big agency project goes wrong, it's more expensive and it impacts more of the state. So is there kind of a, I mean, I think at one point you said we need 50 more project managers. In the long run, I mean, would it be better to centralize and and how can we help you do that to avoid, these huge billion-dollar overruns, that we're seeing now?
That's
and to the extent, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, I think I'll answer that in two ways. I mean, one, as I was mentioning earlier, I think the MITDP portfolio itself has been a little inconsistent. Part of it, and again, I appreciate working with you as well, because I think we came a long way in terms of defining even aside from defining oversight versus project management, we also took a stab at defining what it means to be an MITDP. And in my view, there's a couple of those projects that, I'll give an example. MDH has a VoIP project, so how they do, phones and voice over IP in the department. And in my view, that doesn't really meet the definition of an MITDP. If you need me to oversee MDH, which is a million times bigger than me, if you need me to oversee this sort of standard replace your phones, we have bigger problems. So, I think some of it is right sizing the MITDP portfolio, but making sure that it, what it means to be an MITDP is this is something that is new. It's modernizing something legacy. It's really critical to the state, and it needs both funding and the audit function. So I think partly the work ahead of us is to define, a really tight portfolio. These are transformational projects that we want to make sure have governance and associated funding. So I think that's step one. And then step two, to your point, I would love to see, if not more PM, I don't think it necessarily has to be 50 more PMs. I also think that if we were to get, so one of the things Marcy has done is she's built out core competencies in what you need to design and implement software. So engineering, product management, and design are also really critical pieces of that. If we had a stable, we have one lead designer right now. She actually worked with me at the Department of Defense. She's awesome. If we had more designers who have experience with user research and design, we could steer these projects better from the get-go. A lot of what I've seen over my career, and I know I've shared this with you, but I'll repeat it for the other committee members. But a lot of what I've seen over my career is we start building the wrong solution because we don't really understand the problem. So I think a lot about one of my last projects at the Department of Defense was when we were leaving Afghanistan, and we wanted to make sure that everyone who wanted a visa, any Afghani who'd worked for us, we would be able to correctly identify them when they came forward in their visa project. And so the ask to me, as the digital service director, was find and digitize a record of every single person who has worked for us in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And that's impossible. That's impossible. We're talking about hundreds of different companies, but what we could do, in researching the problem, and this has nothing really to do with project management, more our designers got involved. They met with the State Department, and what they said is we actually need a way for employers to verify employment of the people who come forward, because not all the people who worked for us in Afghanistan are even going to apply. They might not be alive. They might not be interested in leaving the country. What we need is a way for the employer to say, yes, this person worked for me from this state to this state. And that's ultimately what we built for them. And it made the process go that much faster. So, to answer your question, it's definitely more people. I don't always think it has to be project management. I think if we had, better designers or better engineers that could help steer the projects from the beginning, then, those bigger agencies, could kind of be a little bit more independent, knowing that they're on the right track.
All right. Any other questions, Senator Husser? Okay. I just have one follow-up question to Secretary Savage, and then we can move on to the closed session. This is also with regards to MD Think. I understand that it's a cloud service. It's being hosted on Amazon Web Services and AWS. But we keep hearing from DHS that the service is not working. You mentioned CJAMs and other components that are still kind of in the works. How will we know when it actually is working, when the initial build out and integration is complete? Because, I understand that as with a lot of these projects and services, there are constant improvements and iterations, but at what point do we call this complete and working? Because, as a General Assembly, we fund a lot of projects and we go out and we cut ribbons on a lot of these. And when a school's ribbon is cut, we know that it's done, so to speak, it's open, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there aren't continuous renovations or maintenance that goes on, but we've cut the ribbon to say that it's done. At what point are we going to know that MD Think is done? Because it seems like it keeps going on, and it's now several years and over 250% over budget.
Yeah. So, I don't think MD Think as a cloud environment will ever be done. I think what needs to be done are the applications that are on it. I think we need to declare victory on the applications. So if you think about it, to use your school analogy, MD Think is like we built the school. And I think we have to stop saying when is the school going to be done? I think what we want to ask is this classroom ready? Is the cafeteria ready? Is the gym ready? Because I think that's really how we think about it. So as of now, there are 6 different agencies that are tenants on MD Think. So you have labor, DHS, MDH, MHB, and DJS that are all paying into, and they all have applications that are in the environment. And when they say MD Think doesn't work, what they mean is their specific applications, whether that's 2 of them or 10 of them, aren't working for their caseworkers or their staff. And so what we need to dig into is how well their applications are working for them. So my goal, to answer your question, my goal is that next year, Secretary Lopez can say, CJAMS is now working for me. And going back to the earlier question, MD Think writ large will not be in MITDP next year, but CJAMS will be, because we need to hold that specific application accountable. There's always going to be a cost associated with the MD Think environment. And I think we never should have sort of conflated what we're paying for the cloud and what we're paying for these specific applications. But I think what we can see over the coming years is more transparency about what are we paying, what does MD Think cost in terms of, to your point, ongoing O&M. I think that's a number that we can get to. And then what are we paying for to run these specific applications, whether it's juvenile services or eligibility or child support or any of these other programs. And I think those are the things that we need to start tracking, application by application. They should all be a line item. So if there's 83 applications right now, how much do each of them cost? And to the extent that we're spending active development time on any of them, we want to be able to say, this is done. We are no longer working on CJAMS. Secretary Lopez likes it. We're not putting any more developer resources into it.
Do we have a sense, or are you able to provide us an exact list of which applications are considered done and which are not?
We can follow up with that. I would say, I would actually it's actually a healthier prognosis than you might think. When we spent last year working, as I mentioned, with AWS on kind of a diagnostic report of the applications. And what they shared with us is that it is the 3 at DHS that need the most attention. So it's this 3 that I mentioned, E&E, CJAMS, and CSMS. CJAMS also has an implementation by DJS, Juvenile Services. So I would say we're probably in the neighborhood of like, 5 to 10 projects that are kind of need that special attention. And then the other projects, are largely just being hosted in the environment. We can follow up with a specific number, but, I think the diagnostics from AWS and from meeting with these agencies is that there's a handful of them that, as I mentioned earlier, were lifted and shifted without any kind of a reimagining of how they need to work. But it is, the good news is it's a smaller number than we might think.
Okay. I think it's interesting that a lot of the major ones that are still outstanding and pending are actually at the agency that's supposed to be leading MD.
Well, and that's the other piece. And then without getting too much in the weeds, Secretary Lopez and I have talked about this quite a bit. And one of the things that we intend to do over the next year is bifurcate who's working on like MD Think proper and who's working on MD and DHS applications. So I think that was the other thing, again, without getting too much into the organizational design of this, is that the teams were kind of conflated. So, when CJAMS needs work or CSMS needs work, there's a shift, like it's kind of like all hands on deck to fix it. And I think if we're trying to say that MD Think is a platform that we want to operate as a state, we need to like dedicate staff to that. And to your point, call that out as O&M over, year over year. And then what I've talked to Secretary Lopez about is to say, like, let's actually budget for the people that you need to run these applications. So I think that, again, to your point, like the conflation, not only does it not provide the transparency that you as legislators need, it's actually really confusing as a staffing model. We need the people who are dedicated to running a cloud environment and the people who are developers working specifically on those applications, so that, to your point, like they can move through the development, wrap up the work, and exit.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Not, we're going to move into a closed session to discuss some of the specific cybersecurity findings. So we're going to close this